Okay. So, I'm here to sort of lead you a little bit through Unity and what you can do inside Unity. I have a little bit of sort of some PDFs to guide you a little bit about some things. First of all, I do want to talk a little bit about what a game engine is and what a game engine can do, specifically regards to the assets that are used inside the game engine, specifically audio. What a game engine is basically for is taking all of the assets that you've made somewhere else and putting them inside a virtual space of some kind, whether 2D or 3D, and then doing stuff with them. What that means then is that game engines are not places or environments to edit your sounds. You can create situations by which volume or things like that can change based on various conditions inside the game. But you really shouldn't be doing any kind of editing. You can't really edit anything inside a game engine. Certainly not inside Unity, for sure. So we'll just start there. So to talk about Unity, it's obviously the hottest thing that's going these days in the game engine world. There's a number of reasons for it, I think. One of the reasons that I like is that they make a very good and very usable free version of this thing, and it's capable and can fall back to a number of different complexity levels of hardware requirements and things like that. So you can be using this if you want on an ancient iBook. If you really wanted to do that, you can totally use this thing. It can work. It'll work a little on the slow side, of course, but it can fall back and fall back and fall back to lots of different, hardware things rather than the Cry engine, which needs to have literally the most powerful machine possible to run it at all. Anyway, so there's another really good thing about Unity that I like a lot is the extendability of the editor. So that means that actually you can extend what the editor can do, and there's actually a moderate amount of documentation on how to do that. And if you're reasonably comfortable with scripting, it's not super difficult to be able to do your own custom editors. Thirdly, there's a number of things that you can buy. They've created an entire ecosystem quite similar to iTunes, but specifically for the Unity game engine, in which people sell products that go and plug into Unity, including this wonderful game level. I put it together. It was Tinker Toys for me. But this whole thing that you see here is a huge sewer level of objects that cost me $10 to download. Okay? So basically, then I just hooked it all up together, and I changed the sizes of objects and things like this and whatever, and then basically was able to create the level that you saw the demonstration of. We have to actually be inside it. Okay, so the first thing to talk about inside Unity is that Unity uses a file structure that is based upon probably similar structures to a lot of other kinds of game engines, but we'll just sort of describe it. So hopefully this is a reasonably illustrative example here. So basically the red rectangle represents the project. In other words, the project contains everything that is inside it, effectively. The project contains the things that are permanent inside your whole game. So this means all of your 3D models, your textures, your materials, of course, your sound files, things that are called prefabs, which are basically prefabricated objects, game objects that you can actually put inside the project so that you can then reuse them in a number of different kinds of ways. That's a really powerful thing, because then basically you can just edit the characteristics of the prefab and it will go to every copy inside the game automatically, so you don't have to edit every single copy. I mean, so for example, you can set up a characteristics of a box, and then you can just create a bunch of copies of a box, and then you can alter your prefab box object, and then everything will go over to the copies. You can create folders, which is useful for organization, and every project is going to contain a scene, usually, one scene or more. So the scene is equivalent to a game level, and the game level is the scene file itself is sort of semi-permanent, but what's inside the scene is basically temporary. It's going to change constantly. For example, if I have a robot and I shoot the robot disappears from the scene. And if, for example, I shoot some object and then it blows up, then what happens is that object disappears from the scene, and then another object called an explosion appears in its place. So these are all dynamic things that happen inside the scene. Every scene is going to contain one, or probably hundreds, of game objects. A game object is also a temporary object. So it also is going to go away. It can be deleted. It can be, changed in all kinds of ways during the game, and so it's definitely a transitory product essentially. But every game object is going to have a component to it, or many components really, and each component is basically a type of behavior, effectively. And so, but you can have behaviors that change the what's called the transform, which is the basically the position, the rotation, and the scale or size of the object. You can have things that obviously play audio, for example. So there's a lot of different kinds of components that you can have, and they are referred to as components. And so there will be lots of game objects, and all of those game objects will have components. So to go on to the next slide, Unity does what it does through what are called views. So this is where things get a little bit tricky, because as soon as I do this, then the thing disappears, but whatever. So all of these little areas that you see inside the Unity application are referred to as views. Okay, so this is the hierarchy view, the project view, over here the inspector view. If I choose an object, then the inspector view is showing me the characteristics of the object. So hopefully, I don't know if this will make sense here. So the project view, of course, we get to see our 3D modules, our textures, our materials, our sounds, our prefabs, our folders, and our scene files. And then in our scenes, these relate to the hierarchy view. These are the list of the game objects, and the hierarchy view is over here. You'll notice there's no folders in it. It's just a list of a bunch of items, essentially. But it also contains a scene view, which is the 3D game world, and this is where you're going to place all of your game objects. And this is, of course, what we have to get around it. And this is probably one of the hardest things to deal with inside learning how to deal with Unity, is how to get around physically inside the game space. If you've played various games in which you've manipulated cameras in a 3D world, then you're probably you have a very good leg up in figuring this out. But if you haven't dealt with this and all you've been dealing with is just two-dimensional programs like Photoshop or whatever like that, this is going to be a little bit of a trip, because it takes a little bit of expertise to kind of move around and find things and select them, and you can accidentally select things that you didn't want to select. My favorite thing to do is to select an object like so and press the F key. The F key basically frames this object and automatically makes it so that I can go here. So one of my favorite things to do is that if you happen to be ever lost, you click an object that you know where its location is, you press F, and you're going to be right there looking at that object at that point.
If I can just interrupt for a second. The point to show you this and for you is not to turn you into game programmers, right? I mean, to certain degrees, if you have an affinity towards programming, that's a great thing. But the more you understand how these engines work, the better your audio and your sound will work within these worlds. And that's a really important thing to keep in mind as we go through. We're showing it to you because of the logic, the way the logic is run down and the hierarchy of the way things are done. So I just kind of wanted to contextualize it a little bit.
No, that's very important.
In our class that we run, we take people in 8 weeks from, creating their sounds and their audio and understanding this stuff and then putting their own sounds into games. In our workshops, we do it over a weekend. So it's not insurmountable, but it does take a little bit of as audio people, we're used to thinking about things in a certain way, and game engines sort of think about sound a little bit differently than we're used to. So
right.
I just wanted to give
now,
some context.
Another really interesting quote that I recently read on the IASIG educational workgroup mailing list was Richard Stevens, who wrote a really great book called The Game Audio Tutorial, which is based more on the UDK, the Unreal Development Kit. And he said that really game audio kind of forces the game audio people to become game designers themselves. So I think that was a really, really good point, and completely agree with that statement. So you kind of have to know how the game thinks, and that does require understanding a little bit about how computers think. Anyway, so going on. So the things that we're concerned with is sound inside Unity. So sound inside Unity is done through the object, the component called, or actually I maybe complete this little bit here. So we had scene view here, we had the inspector view, which is the properties of the objects, the components of which we're going to talk about the most important components relating to audio, and then the game view, which is how you can try out your level. So I can just quickly do that. The game view is right here in the obvious playback arrow. So you can just basically go here and you'll start hearing Brennan's music.
All right, soldier. We sent an advance scout team 10 minutes ago, but we haven't heard back from them. Your job is to check on their status, retrieve them, and neutralize any enemy hostiles you encounter. Get to it, soldier.
Okay, so on this particular thing, I can hit the escape bar to free the mouse up. So what happens in this particular case is I just ran into a trigger there, but and we'll talk a little bit about the interactivity about that a little bit in the. But that was just game view, so that enables me to try out my level, essentially. Now, there's a couple of very important things about game view, which is that if you happen to be working anywhere inside the scene view or anything having to do with the hierarchy, and you're already in game view, and as soon as you get out of game view, you lose all your changes to anything that you did inside the scene or inside the hierarchy. So that's a really good point to remember when you're starting to work in Unity is don't be sitting there and editing a bunch of stuff while you're playing the game. Because you can also do things like you can play the game, right? And you can hit pause. And then that makes you think that the game is actually not running, right? You can just do that. But the game is still running. So if you were to go and change some figure here, like let's say you change this value here of this transfer, actually that is a prefab, so wait, hang on. I don't want to suddenly do something that
It's too much info flowing now.
Yeah.
To absorb.
Okay.
Yeah.
Anyway, so basically the deal is that you'll lose your changes at that point, so you just got to keep that in mind.
There's a setting to change the tint when you're running, so I changed mine to pink or something, and it's a visual indicator, so I never get it wrong.
Oh, okay.
It's in the, if you go to File, Edit Preferences and Colors.
Right.
You can change that there.
Oh, interesting. So you can actually change, learn something new every day. Okay, awesome. Cool. All right. So what happens is that what plays audio inside Unity is called the audio source. And the thing that listens to the audio, or is called the audio listener, basically. And this comes straight out of Fmod. This terminology comes straight out of Fmod, and it's common to those particular kinds of situations. So basically, you can only have one audio listener in any scene. You can't have more than one, but you can have as many audio sources as the game engine can possibly handle, which can be hundreds for big ones. In the case of audio sources, if we take a look at an audio source object, let's go do that. The one-time trigger. See if that's the one I want. Yep, that's the one. So that's on the other side. So in this case, what happens is I have the object here that I'm selecting, and there is a component added to that called the audio source, and the audio source is here. An audio source can be both a source of audio and it can play an actual audio clip. So even though you see this none audio clip here, that doesn't necessarily mean that no sound is going to happen. It's a little bit weird about how they did this, but basically it means that this just is convenient to the way that that you can play sounds in audio. You can play in a number of different ways. You can use audio.play, and if that happens, then you've already loaded up something here inside this clip, or you've set it up in some way. Or you can have it as a value in a script, and you can play it as a one-shot, which is exactly what I did here. In this particular case, what I did was I created an object called, that's basically functioning as a trigger. So when my player object collides with this is like one-to-one interactivity, effectively. So when my player collides with this particular object, we have something called a collider. And the collider has an option called a trigger option on it. And I've checked the trigger option. If I didn't check the trigger option and I decide to play the game, I'm not going to be able to go down the tunnel at all. I'll just bump into this thing. And I won't be able to trigger my audio. So I have to go through the object in order to be able to do this. So if I turn this back on, then basically there it is, got that going on. So now if I pass through that, this state can be monitored by the engine so that when I have a script going on, I can actually look at the script and see what's going on there. So in this case, I have a function called onTriggerEnter, and I'm looking for the object that's the player, which means that if a robot were to suddenly wander through here, even though it's also been marked as a trigger, it wouldn't automatically trigger that. So I'm specifically looking for the tag called player in this case. So that's my player object. If a robot were to run into this, nothing would happen. And then I say, audio, play one shot, my clip. And I've defined my clip right here. But I didn't say what it was, right? I just said my clip is an audio clip. But I didn't say what file I really want to use that with. So what happens in this case is I can drag the VO file that I want, that I've imported inside here, directly into the audio clip. So for example, that was my VO level 1 start, which is this one.
All right, soldier. We sent an advance scout team 10 minutes ago, but we haven't heard back from them. Your job is to check on their...
Okay, and so then basically what happens is that I can then drag that over the object. It's a little bit tricky. If I release the mouse button, then I have to go back and select this again. But basically what happens is, say, if I wanted to use a different file, I can just drag that over here, like so. I can also click this little tiny dot here, and then from that, I can select which audio file I really want, and it'll go to that object. I can also set that stuff directly up in the script if I want to, but this is a relatively convenient way to do this.
So when you deliver that asset sheet to an integrator, every single item has to be put in and attached to that object, right? Just want to be clear about that, right? So your sounds are intimately tied to everything in the universe, and someone has to make that happen.
Yeah. Well, you're effectively becoming an integrator at this point. You know, you're almost a programmer at this point because you're really just like putting the stuff in there and defining the conditions under which, you know, the sound is going to be played. But this is relatively simple stuff. Now, another thing about this script that's interesting is I call it a one-time trigger. The reason why is because afterwards, it's going to wait for the sound to play, and then it's going to actually destroy the game object afterwards. So I can only play it one time. Now, at the moment, it's a one-shot, which means that theoretically I could go back and hit it a bunch of times before it finished playing. But once one of the instances got to the end, it would disappear. So, but for now, what happens is we start the game, I go through it,
All right, soldier.
plays the thing,
We sent an advance scout team 10 minutes ago, but we haven't heard
watch
back
what
from them.
happens.
Your job is to check on their status, retrieve them, and neutralize any enemy hostiles you encounter. Get to it, soldier.
And it's gone.
Right.
So,
Now we're showing it to you, but in most games you play, you don't see the triggers, right?
obviously, yes. Yeah,
You just make it invisible.
they are, in fact, invisible.
Yeah.
And it's quite easy to do that. All you have to do in this particular case is turn off the mesh renderer. But then you don't know where things are sometimes as a result. And there's a couple ways that you can kind of deal with it. One good way that's nice is up here in the corner. See where this box is? That's just sort of like a generic game object icon. You can change it to this, and it'll actually list the object here. And so even if it's invisible, it shows up there as a one-time trigger. You know, the name is right there. So that's kind of useful. Anyway, so yeah, that's weird. It's not doing the right click at all there. Thank you. There we go.
Why isn't it destroyed immediately?
Because I didn't want it to destroy immediately. It's going to wait. Oh, I should say, hey, hang on. Because it says yield, wait for seconds, the length of the clip. It waits until the clip is finished playing. Okay.
At the
So
end.
footsteps, in this case, I didn't do it by taking the sound from, FMod Studio because I can't really do that. But if we take a look at the player object, first-person player, that's who's walking around. He doesn't look like much, by the way. If you want to take a look at what the first-person player looks like, just turn around. It looks like that. There's a gun, and it's sort of like a capsule-like thing. So there you go. And it's a camera. Basically, that's the deal. So, all right, I'm going to go to my first-person player. Now, in my first-person player, I have created a lot of options here. There's a lot of stuff here. But in the script here called footsteps, I have a category called metal steps and a category called concrete steps. So when I'm actually on an object that's tagged as metal, it will flip to the metal steps. And if I'm otherwise, it'll play the concrete steps, essentially. So if I'm here, and it'll randomly select between them, basically. Well, that is if it decides to play them, because it likes to do that sometimes. Fun stuff. Come on. There we go.
All right, soldier. We sent an advanced scout team 10 minutes ago, but we haven't heard back from them. Your job is to check on their status, retrieve them, and neutralize any enemy hostiles you encounter. Get to it, soldier. Bravo team, this is Alpha here. We encountered hostiles and are engaging. Request immediate assistance. Repeat, request immediate assistance. And look med kits around in case of casualties.
And that's the metal one. Back here on this, and on the stone again. Okay? So
now
that's
you-
quickly there.
Right. So now you've seen those footsteps built in Fmod, right? Edited individually in Pro Tools, produced, and put together in Fmod, and now you see them put together by script, right?
Right, in this case. And I also have them randomized in pitch, actually. I have an option here where basically I have a current pitch and I have a pitch percentage that it goes up and down 15% in pitch so that I can get a more believable kind of situation. You can also do that inside Fmod Studio. I didn't have time to demonstrate that. So the last thing I'm going to talk about is our music. So we've been able to actually take this music and through another tool called Fabric. It's a little bit of a complex sort of thing to talk about. We probably don't have a whole lot of time. But what we have is an object here at the very top called Audio Master. So Fabric is a series of tools that is eventually going to be released independent of Unity. But originally it was made to work within Unity using the Fmod engine and allow Fmod Designer-like functionality effectively. Within Unity, so that you didn't have to use Fmod Designer to do so. But you could basically do the same kinds of things. Randomize sounds, randomize pitches, you could do parameter lines, all of these kinds of things. So Fabric works an event system, quite similar to Fmod. Fmod is an event-based system as well. And so we have a list of these events that I've created. I've created an event here called foo, and an event called bar. If you know our programming kinds of things, those are sort of in jokes. And then there's a stop all option. The start option is actually a fake thing, but anyway. So what happens in this case, the foo is going to start playback of our audio. All 5 of our tracks are going to play at one time, but we're not going to hear the volume except on one of them, depending on our timeline. So what happens in this case is all of these things, these events, are being addressed to an object that's underneath them called Event 00, which is coming from Fmod Designer. I was able to import this from Fmod Designer. And now that I've done this, if you take a look over here inside Fabric on the timeline, I actually have all of the data from the Fmod Designer that I was editing inside Unity as data. So now I can basically move through and change it. In fact, if I wanted to, I could probably just do it myself. Here, 1 second. So this, let me just see if I can do this. I have to get out of here, then I have to go, let me see. Yeah, this is gonna be interesting.
Need 2 screens.
Yep, just like I was doing in Fmod Designer. Right? So, I've currently hooked it up so that what happens is that when I'm inside the game and I encounter an enemy, it will ramp up the intensity of the music, essentially. So it will make it more, more intense for me to experience. And the more the robots continue to attack me or whatever like that, then basically the more the music is going to get intense. So I'll show you that.
Yeah. Can you go full screen?
Can I go full screen?
All right,
Yeah,
soldier.
sure.
We sent an advanced scout team 10 minutes.
Okay, hear that again, over and over again. Okay, hang on one sec. Yes, in game, you go and that option here is called maximize on play. So if you go maximize on play, hit that, you get the whole screen.
All right, soldier. We sent an advanced scout team 10 minutes
Give my
ago.
bad
We have nearby
FPS
Your job,
playing
check on the
ability
status,
here.
retrieve them, and neutralize any enemy hostiles you encounter. Get to it, soldier.
Alright, second ones.
Bravo team, this is Alpha here.
Alright.
We encountered hostiles and are engaging. Request immediate assistance. Repeat, request immediate assistance. And get medkits on
Okay, so now I'm on level 1, believe it or not. Not the first one. Now, if I've got this correct, and running into this next one. Come on. Okay. Yeah. And that's our third.
Bravo, this is Alpha. We're getting killed out here. This is outside. I don't know how long we can hold out. They're going
Alright, so hopefully I can get one more level on here. Come on. It's not cooperating.
Or just hit the trigger.
Come on.
Gotta get to the fourth
It's
level.
not doing it.
Yeah.
It's not wanting to do it. Yep. Figured I'd demonstrate it fine in the demo, and then when it gets to the actual thing, I wouldn't work. Yeah. At this point, basically, it's just not getting past the first level. But you get an idea that it's at least changing a little bit there.
So, any questions? I mean, that's pretty much, you've now seen single triggers. You've seen how footsteps can be made in Fmod. You've seen how they can be made within the game engine itself. You've got a picture of, music, and how to import that from something like Fmod into the engine. Yeah, question.
What sort of situation would it be where you'd actually have to start writing JavaScript stuff? It seems sort of like maybe that's something you do at a small studio where you're kind of responsible
Well, unfortunately,
for a
in
lot of
Unity,
things,
you
or-
have to do it all the time. And guess what? It's not even JavaScript. It's actually some sort of scripted form of C# instead. Basically, the only thing that you can do inside Unity without having to know how to program something is put a sound and make it loop in the background as an ambience.
And would that be
That's it.
something that is, what's the range of things that an audio designer in games would have to do? It's kind of my question. Would you have to go to that level to make
that's a
the
good
script?
question.
Yeah, that is a good
It's an
question.
important question. So, that is a personal decision, right? So, for example, I started doing sound for games in the early 90s. And I have always held a really hard line. It's like, I want to know what the engines do. I want to be a technical evangelist, but I want to make music. I want to make sounds. I do not want to be a programmer, right? So that's been a personal decision on my part. And there have been many times when I've thought, God, if I could only get in there and do it, I could make this happen, right? And there are a lot more technical composers and designers who can do that, right? But not all of us are geared that way. So that's why I say it's a personal question, because in games, right, the more knowledge that you have of programming and integration, the more valuable you can be, right, to the company or to the team or however that works. So it's a hard question to answer, because it really gets down to that question: what do I want to be when I grow up?
Yeah, I mean,
Right?
I definitely have to say, from my perspective, and of course I'm more of a geek and a hacker and things like that. I won't forget very soon when Clint Bajakian came into the classroom at the Academy or University and was talking about the types of people that come to Sony and work and stuff like that, and he basically said that it's an assumed thing that every single applicant for the position of an intern will be already really sufficiently good at being able to make sound and music. That's the ground level, period. Like, you're already really, really good at making sound and music. That's
Right,
the
so-
ground level for the industry. So, in my opinion, anything that you can bring to the table that is more than just that skill level, like being able to work with Fmod and things like that, of course, is just a minimum. Is going to be a benefit to your resume.
And this is coming from someone like Scott, who is incredibly fearless and intrepid. I mean, he just dives into these programs, puts these things together, and I just go, wow. I'm the guy who gets scared, if my Mac doesn't boot up the same way every day, and I'm like, oh, so, yeah, he makes fun of me. But, so it is, it is that kind of a situation. It depends on how much you like, what you've seen in terms of scripting. If you're the type of person who likes to get their hands dirty and open that stuff up again, the more you know about it, right? From my point of view, I've always felt the more I know about it, the more I understand it, the more I can contextualize it. And maybe I'm not the guy to write that code, but I know what needs to be done.
Yes, in that
and
case,
how it can be done.
In this case, you can have the conversation with the programmer and say, this is what I need.
Yeah.
For example, I'll tell you one really, really simple thing that I run into all the time is that what happens is that game state changes can sometimes happen very rapidly and very continuously. And what happens is sometimes you don't want that kind of continuous change inside the game. You want less change. What you want is, oh, I'm battling. Oh, I'm not battling. But then what happens is you look at a script and you see like an attack function. You think, okay, I'll just put my thing here, attack. And then you maybe put a print statement to say, okay, how many times is this thing being called? And you see an entire raft of print statements that just goes like that, which means that if you had like a sound being triggered, you'd be like, it would be triggering the sound constantly. So you have to figure out a way of like lessening the amount that gets triggered. So you can talk to your program and say, hey, can you make that be less often, essentially? And he can possibly help you with that. And so that'll help make your music better in the game.
Yeah. Question in the back.
So Fabric Manager, is that like a plugin you have to buy for Unity?
Oh, no, it's kind of similar to Fmod Designer and Fmod Studio. It's free for using to just learn how to do it.
Oh, okay.
I know the developer pretty well, actually, and so he's going to make it so that you can use it, but when you want to put it inside a game, it's a per-release license, just like Fmod.
So you just import an FTP file directly?
Oh, in this case, that FTP functionality is going to be not currently available. There were some slight potential issues of, not being kosher per se, legally per se. So he doesn't have it in the newest function, but you could, if you wanted to, set up your own timeline with your own tracks, and trigger things exactly in the same way that you do with Fmod Designer.
Okay. And so say if you're using Fabric Manager, how much can you get away without, scripting in here?
Some. Depends on what common types of game tasks you're doing. There's some things where I just think to myself, he could have made it a little bit easier if you just did this, whatever. But, it's okay. So for some of the basic things like start, stop, playing on awake, playing on update, you can do a fair amount of things. For other kinds of more like this timeline thing, I did have to write a little bit of scripting to be able to say, here I am on this timeline, here I am on this parameter line. I had to actually program that in.
Question over here.
Does Unity only work for first-person shooters? Does it work for other types of games?
Everything.
I figured.
It completely works for anything.
I'm a third-person shooter fan myself, so.
No worries. Yeah.
Yeah.
In fact, there's a third-person demo, shooter demo with like a guy being shot by a big orb or something that you can download. And so it's totally
so like
possible
RPGs
to do.
and like
Anything.
turn-based games.
People are making 2D games on Unity. Oddly, it's not great at it, but you can get toolkits that make it much better to be able to do 2D things.
Right.
People make adventure games. I know a turn-based strategy game that I've played that's kind of like a civilization game in space, and that's made entirely in Unity, using Fmod for the engine, actually.
Yeah.
Question?
Yeah, please. One more question.
I was just curious, like, what sort of advice would you give to someone who wanted to write music for video games, like in terms of like format and length or intensity? Like when you're looking to license music, what would you be looking for?
That is a really good question to start out our next segment.
Yes.
Because what we're going to do now, I mean, you've seen the workflow, right? You've seen different variations on that workflow. And now we're going to take a short break and relax again. And we're going to come back. I'm going to give a little overview to our talk, and we're going to bring Jim Hedges up from Zynga, who entered the building. He was able to get in. And Richard Warp from Leapfrog. They're both here. And we're going to have a little business panel talk. And I think that would be a great question for both of those guys as well as for us, and would kick us off to have a good conversation. So are you comfortable waiting a couple minutes?
Absolutely.
Awesome. Okay, so let's take a short break, and we'll come back with our panel.